Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar organized by JetBrains. I'm Paul Everett, PyCharm Developer Advocate. I'll be your host. The topic for today's webinar is writing REST with Django and Ninja. And I'll go ahead and Christopher, I'll do an early spoiler. Christopher has a spoiler in his slide notes about this topic. Christopher is a prolific instructor and podcaster with our friends at Real Python. And Ninja is... I guess I'd say FastAPI for Django. Welcome, Christopher. Thanks for joining us. Did I get it wrong?
No, that's they're even very obvious about it. They fully in the documentation say heavily inspired by FastAPI. So yeah, it's not a coincidence. It's very much driven that way. So it's if you're used to the sort of Django view thing, you essentially add some decorators and you're into REST API land with very little extra code. Far simpler to get going than, say, the Django REST framework, if that's what you're used to. So yeah.
And in fact, Pydantic, right?
It is, yes. And in fact, I've been finding between Ninja and a few other places recently, I keep running into and yet another library that serializes things in yet another way. And I'm starting to think that maybe Django should just have something built in so that the ORM does it for you, because it seems to have been written about 4 or 5 times now. So yes, very much so.
But that's the fun part to write, you know?
I guess, I don't know. I've been working on the what's new in Python 3.11, and one of the features they've added is some meta information to the typing area, which allows you to describe these kinds of serializers so that the typing libraries can recognize them. So even the language itself is getting to a place where it's like, oh, maybe we should expose this information. So
funny enough, I wrote a dependency injector that uses annotated and filed begging requests to get the thing that is coming in 3.11. So I definitely with you. Real quick, where are you from?
I'm based out of Toronto, Canada.
All right. And we have in the chat people from all over the place. We'll get back to that in a little bit. You've been working as an independent consultant for a long time, a path I spent a similar amount of time on, actually. What's it been like recently, and how has the Python market changed in the 400 decades that you've been in it?
It's can't be more than 300. Don't age me, Paul. Honestly, well, Python I find is one of these languages that it still feels like it's growing. There are a lot of different areas that the language is getting used in. So I'm starting to get to a place where the phrase Python developer is almost meaningless, right? I'm a web developer who uses Python, or I'm a data scientist who uses Python, or I'm an ML expert who uses Python, or I'm a sysadmin who uses Python, right? So, and quite frankly, each of those groups ends up using different parts of the language as well. So the parts that I know and I'm familiar with, I don't really know. I'm not a machine learning guy, so I read a machine learning article and it's like, oh, I didn't know the language could do that. And it's not just the libraries, it's the language itself. There's last count, there's over 300 modules in the standard library. Who could know it all, right?
Yeah, when you read the PyPI monthly transfer stats, you're like, yes, I've never heard of that unit of measurement.
Yeah.
So, you go back far enough that I'm sure you sat down with potential customers and you said Python and you got a blank look on their face, right?
Yeah, it's the snake jokes have stopped, thankfully. Yeah, it's frequently number 1 or number 2 in most of the surveys now. Yep. So my folks know what it is at this point, which tells you something, right?
That's right. One more point about your background. Your real Python output is admirable. I say that in a tone that's both envious and angry about how you're making the rest of us look. You ever hit a spot where you think, what's there left to talk about?
I actually, most of the real Python content is based on the articles. So although I do occasionally, and in fact, the talk that we're about to go into was one of mine where I'm like, we should do this. A significant amount of it is someone's written an article and then we coursify it, which means we've got the advantage of seeing what is popular and what's hitting the keywords and all that. So there isn't as much that way that I find, I don't need much inspiration. I go through the list and go, oh, I'd learn more about that and write a course about it, or hey, I think I could do that quickly because I know it well. So I don't really have a problem with the muses per se.
I will say this. I'm guessing, but the number one thing in my browser history is the Real Python Ultimate Guide to Data Classes. I go to that thing a trillion times a day. Okay, we've got a full slate of Django and APIs and PyCharm stuff to cover. So let's go ahead and jump into the slides. We'd like to make this webinar as live and conversational as possible. Christopher and I were talking and before we went on screen about he and I are both people, and doing things remotely in pandemic has been a bit of a struggle, but we've learned to adapt and try and engage with people. So, hey, everybody, let's be engaging. We'll look over here and say, hi, Essex, hi, Nigeria, hi, Oxford, and try and talk to everybody a little bit. Should you have any questions or problems during the webinar, go ahead and ask them. Feel free to ask them during the presentation using this chat in YouTube, or we're also in Twitch. We'll also have a few pauses during the webinar where Christopher will be like, hey, Paul, got any questions? And I'll be like, hey, Christopher, we answered a bunch of them, but this one we need you to answer. So try and come up with some good questions as we go along so that Christopher and I will have stuff to talk about. Usually the number one question is always, is this being recorded? Funny enough, this time somebody asked the question before the webinar started, thus ruining my joke. Yes, it's being recorded. It will be available essentially immediately. This is, after all, YouTube. Okay, with that in place, we're all set. Christopher, get us up to speed on Django and Ninja.
All right, so I'll bore you a little bit with some slideware. I promise it won't take too long and we'll get into the code. I don't know if this little guy has a name, but he's our mascot for Ninja. So if you're going off and looking around, you'll see his little flying t-shirt and cladded place there. Before we spend too much time in code, I want to give you a little bit of background depending on your degree of REST. REST is a protocol that isn't a protocol. It's this sort of mishmash ideas. Essentially, the concept is you want to use HTTP operations like get and post plus some payload, and this is how you communicate with a web server. And it's become very, very common particularly with single page applications. So if you're writing in, say, React or Angular or Vue, you're writing a JavaScript application, you need to send JSON off to the server. Django, often people go, oh, but then you can't Django. Well, actually you can. You just build Django as the back end and don't use the templating side of it. I tend to hybrid a lot of my applications. So I end up with what I jokingly call multi-page applications. So I tend to mix and match between when I want to do take advantage of the Vue templates inside of Django, the power of those. And then there's other times where I go off and I need something a little fancier. And so I usually mix in some Vue. And so something like Ninja and REST is a good way of being able to do that. So if you're going down that path, you use the views for your REST endpoints. And as we mentioned in the intro there, Ninja is a FastAPI inspired mechanism for doing this, and it's all based on decorators. So the concepts of REST come down to the operations that you're going to be doing inside of your endpoints. And one of my most favorite acronyms inside of computer science is CRUD, and that stands for create, read, update, and delete. And those are the things that you need to do to data. So inside of REST, the create is done through a post. That's the same action your browser uses when it's submitting a form. And the URL that you're using there is usually named after the kind of object that you're creating. So in my example here, if I'm creating a person, the URL would have /person at the end, and then the body of the post would have some parameters in it, which is our payload that specifies the attributes of the person that I'm creating. So first name, last name, that kind of good stuff. There's usually two variations on reading. One is give me a list of things, and the other is give me a specific thing. So the URL for the list is usually the same URL as for the create. and that's just the object I'm trying to get. So if I'm getting a person, I do a get operation and I get back a list of people. And if I want to get a specific one, we go very Django-esque here and we add a parameter to the end of the URL. So in the example here on the third item there is I'm getting person with the ID number 42, and I would get back a payload. The update uses operations, two different operations, two variations here. These aren't as common. The gets and posts that most people have heard of. Puts and patches, you probably haven't come across them unless you're actually using REST, but they are also HTTP operations. The concept here is kind of a mix between the create and the get. So I am using a URL that is specific. I am updating person number 42. But I am passing in parameters inside of the body, which is what am I updating? So if I use put, I am by convention sending in all of the information and overwriting all of the fields. And by patch, I'm allowed to put in just specific fields. So if I was doing a patch call here, I would just say first name Robert to replace Bob, and then I wouldn't have to pass anything else in. There is nothing in REST that enforces any of this. This is convention. And so this is where you got to be a little careful when you're coding, because that person who's written that REST interface may not be compliant with what the pseudo standard is. So you always got to read the documentation and understand what they're trying to do there. And then my de in CRUD is for delete. And very much like my get of a person here, I just specify the URL. And in this case, I would be removing person number 42. Some folks will have this return the thing that was deleted. I don't like that because I find it can get a little confusing, because if it's gone, it should be gone. I usually just return some sort of status indicator here, like a success flag inside of a dictionary. Okay. So that's the basic concept. So let's actually see this in action. So I have already started a Django project here that is called Westeros. I'm going to, as we go through the exercises here, I'll be adding a couple different Django apps, and then we're going to watch how this works and how the pieces fit together. So far, what I've got set up is a virtual environment, my basic Django Westeros settings area with the settings file, URLs, and WSGI. And I've got a little bit of data here that I'm going to be pulling in later. So let me get started by, let's install. It's pip installed like anything else. Nothing like watching somebody else's computer do something. And there we go. Ninja's installed and we're ready to go. So I'm going to show this off with a new app, which appropriately enough for Westeros. Start app. Let me make sure I spell this correctly. We're going to start off with the Lannister app. And then I'm going to open up the settings file and add Lannister to the settings file. Okay. Then on the left-hand side here, because I created the app, I've got the standard admin, apps, models, tests, views, all that kind of good stuff. By convention, we usually put the Django API things in a file called API. So I'm going to create a new file here called api.py. The first thing I need to do is get something from Ninja. There are a couple different ways of talking to Ninja. I'm going to be showing you the mechanism that uses a router. I'll talk later about, there's a slightly simpler version, but usually what you end up doing, particularly if you've got a Django application, is you end up with an API file for each one of your apps that you're going to expose through REST. And if you're doing it that way, using the router is usually a good way to go. Once I've got the router, I need to create an instance out of a router object. And with that, I just start creating my interface. So my decorator here is, let me just put in the piece, here we go. So my decorator here, this is where we get very FastAPI like. I take the @router concept. I am doing a get operation. So this is already saying, hey, what HTTP operation do I want to do? And then I map that to a path. Now, this is not the complete path. I'll show you how that gets built in a second. But what I'm doing is tying in the partial portion of the path called home with this view that I'm building. Just like any view inside of Django, this takes at bare minimum a request object, and it gets called with a request object like any other Django view. So this isn't different from what you're used to. And then all you need to do here is return something that can be serialized. And for example, one of those things that can be serialized into JSON is just a vanilla string. Okay. So with this view in place, we're now ready to start mapping this. In order to do that, I want to open up the urls.py file. And the first thing I'm going to do is go and get that router that I just created. I've renamed it on the import because I'm going to be doing this over and over and over again with a bunch of different apps. So I don't want to just call it router because that would be confusing. So I'm bringing it in as the Lannister router. Oh, I've missed an import. My apologies. With the router imported, I'm going to create a Ninja object. And this is the key part as to how everything gets tied together. And then inside of that, I am going to declare my router. So I'm going to put all my Lannister stuff underneath a Lannister path. And I'm going to pass in the Lannister router to wire it up. And then the last thing I need to do is actually tell Django where this is. So I'm going to add a path. And this is the API. And this is why when I mentioned inside of the Lannister view that /home isn't good enough. What ends up happening is we are declaring API URLs. It's getting pulled in. It will be hosted at the API root. The router for Lannister will be on top of that. So it'll be API/Lannister. And then if I go back in here, the home will be on top of that. So it'll be this particular view will be /API/Lannister/home. Okay. So that's all we need to do. So I'm going to start a server. And then I'm going to dig out curl. If you haven't used this before, this is a command line tool for getting things from the web. First thing to note, and this is I have two complaints about Ninja. This is the first one. They do not stick with the Django standard of putting slashes on the end of things. So although I very much want to put a slash here, it will not find it. So this endpoint is done without that slash, and you have to remember that as you go along. So I'm going to call curl. I'm going to hit with this URL, and what comes back is exactly that string. So what has happened here is the server's been hit at local port 8000. The API Lannister route has called the home view. The home view has done a get because curl by default does a get. And what comes back is the resulting string. And it's that simple. A few lines of code, and you've already got your basic API running. So Paul, you told me to pause and wait for questions. Now might be a good time to do that. So are there questions?
Perfect timing, because I just typed, I'll get that question to him. Kind of a softball question, at the same time a good chance to riff a little bit. What are the main reasons for using Django Ninja over DRF?
So I find Ninja's definitely easier to get going. Ninja is very opinionated. It really is favors JSON payloads. And the basic decorator mechanism I find is simpler to use than what's built into the DRF. It's newer, And because it takes advantage of, which I'll be showing you later, some of the knowledge of type annotations, it's far easier to create serialization mechanisms because all of this is kind of built in using some of the newer tech. Because the DRF is sort of the granddaddy and it's been around longer, some of that takes a lot more work. That being said, the DRF has a lot more depth. So if you wanted to switch from JSON to something else, or if you want to take advantage of, there are dozens and dozens of packages out there for doing, for example, you can output Excel documents from the DRF. So if you're just getting going and you're trying to do something for, say, React or Angular, my go-to now is Ninja. If you're trying to do something far fancier, there's some depth in DRF that still provides some value.
A lot of good points from what you're just saying. The choice a lot of times is over the old, mature, not sexy thing, which
Yes.
happens to have 500 integrations that are valuable to you. And every question you might ever ask is out there in Stack Overflow. So one shouldn't just disregard DRF, but it does feel like between async and type hinting, that there's this line of demarcation in the world of Python, and things written since the arrival of those that presume those are both present have a different developer experience than things that might have had it bolted on afterwards. And FastAPI just stormed to prominence because it was written as if everybody was using type hinting.
Yeah. Oh, and you mentioned the async part as well. Ninja has been very careful about trying to do that. So if you're using this on top of something like Daphne, you're able to do it. And Django is slowly over the last couple of releases been adding increasingly amount of access through asynchronous calls as well. So this is, like you said, that the advantages of it being a newer implementation, there are things that can take advantage of when they're ready.
There's another aspect to what you just said, which is, sure, async might be possible in some of these old things, but it's not normal.
Yeah.
And so when you walk up to something where it is the first class way to do it, you're not going to have any problems. Yeah. Let me go through a couple other questions that came up, also questions I had. The very first question was, why not just use FastAPI? Now, I didn't get an answer back whether the person meant FastAPI with Django or just FastAPI. You can choose whichever one you want to answer.
So I tend to, I spend a lot of time in the Django world. And so for me, it really comes down to a straight familiarity thing. I know how to solve problems in Django. So this becomes a small thing that I add on top of my existing knowledge, and it solves the kinds of problems that I have. So if you are the opposite, which you're deep into FastAPI, then maybe, there isn't that value here. I often get similar questions of, Django versus Flask kind of stuff as well. What I find is in most projects of a certain size, what ends up happening is you end up having, if you're not in the Django world, what you end up doing is pulling in a whole bunch of libraries so that you end up building the Django world, right? So I see it with Flask implementations all the time.
It's true on the front end too. React, boy, it's easy to learn. There's nothing in it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is some value I find in everything being included. It tends to make the library a little more opinionated, which means you kind of have to do it their way. You might be fighting upstream if you try to do it otherwise. But the flip side of it is, if you do it their way, it tends to go a lot more smoothly, and you're not going to run into, why doesn't this library interact with that library? So these are always, these are the kinds of pros and cons that professional developers have to trade off all the time.
Yep. Freedom through constraint. Let me give you 3 rapid fire questions.
Sure.
Does Ninja handle authentication?
Yes, it does.
Can we integrate with the existing DRF?
That's an interesting question. I don't know how or why. It's another library, so I don't see why not. You could host them simultaneously and put it up in a separate path, but Ninja has its own way of doing serialization, so it depends on what you mean by integrate. You're not going to end up using DRF serialization. So could they both live in an existing project? Yes. I've never tried it, but it should.
Last question, what you're showing is synchronous, or are you going to show any async await?
No, I'm going to stick with the synchronous stuff for today.
Okay. But they should just understand, go to the website and you'll see async await all over the place.
That's right. Yeah. So
Right.
Ninja is very much, it's like you said, first class citizen here for async. So if you're coming from the AWS ASGI world, this is all something that you can do without a problem.
Okay. So thanks for taking the questions. Back to you.
Okay. So we've built out our first API. So let's add another one. So what I've done here is added a view that takes a parameter. So there are a couple different ways in Ninja to be able to handle this. The way I've done this at the moment is we'll treat it as a query string. So by essentially just adding the argument to the rock view, I automatically get a query string management. Let's try that again. All right. So nothing else needs to change because I've already registered the router and this registers against the router. I don't have to add anything else to urls.py. I'm good to go. I have the rock interface. So let me just go out to curl and we'll take a quick look at this. And there you go. So by passing in the query parameter, automatically the same name that you give it inside of the view is the name of the query parameter, and it gets passed through down to the view. A couple things to note here. First and foremost, the query strings are always strings. So although that I've put in the 650 here, this actually is not 650. So if I go back in, and just hide this. And if I add one, that's going to fail because I can't add a string and one. Python does not let me do that. And I'm so grateful. JavaScript lets you do it, and it screws me up every single time. So if we want to actually do this, what we need to do instead is tell Ninja that this is an integer, and it will take care of it for you. So this is where we start seeing the use of the type hinting to help us in our interface. So by telling Ninja that height is expected to be an integer, I'm all set. It will convert it for me. And if I come back here, it now does the addition. The other thing to note here is because I haven't specified otherwise, this is a mandatory parameter. So if I did not include height as a query string, it would throw out an error that I had not provided it. I can also provide these as, instead of as query strings, I can provide it as a Django style parameter instead. And I do that by changing the path itself. So I can say in here that I want this to be an integer and a height. And this will allow me to do this in Django style instead. Now, you do not need the int here inside of the path, and having it here doesn't actually convert it, but it does tell Django that it's an int in the path. So Django will give you a 404 if you put something besides an integer. So you kind of have to belt and suspenders here, once to tell Django and once to tell Ninja, so that you get the path declaration as well as the conversion. So let's go back to curl and we'll try this out. And there you go. I've changed it from being a query parameter into a URL style mechanism. And this is my preference. This is from being a old Django guy. That's both bold and old at Django. And so this is the way I'm used to seeing the URLs and letting us do these things.
Hey, Chris, we're right in the middle of a question about this.
Sure, go for
Can
it.
you, from curl, put something that's not an integer and let us see the...
Yep. That's a mess.
Now, that's because of the Django path, right?
No, this is because what you're getting back is a 404. And so what's happening in
Okay.
curl is you're actually getting back Django's 404. So
Got it.
let me, just so that, let me find that URL. And put it in a browser. And it's because I've put the int inside of that path, you're getting back a 404 because Django says there is no path that matches this without an integer because we've put that inside of that inside of those curly brackets.
Got it.
Okay. Other questions?
Nope, that's it.
Okay.
Just to be clear, if you went back to the API and took it out of the path and just left the height int statement in, would you get back a non-HTML response so that Django wasn't? Yeah, right. Cool.
So what's happened here is Django isn't rejecting it, so you're no longer getting the 404.
Right.
You're getting into the view, and now Ninja is saying, I expect an integer. And so instead of getting back the serialized string, you're getting back a where is it? Headers. I'm blanking on what number it's returning for whatever reason, but you're getting back an error. You're getting back an error code, and essentially inside of Ninja itself, it includes some serialized information telling you. So if you were doing this with something like Vue or React,
indeed,
allow you to like pop up a dialog box with the appropriate error message.
Yeah, those people are using Postman or something like that for and so this is a very natural way for API developers to be told invalid payload.
That's right. Well, and it goes deeper than that because it isn't just for the API developers, because you can, we won't be getting into it today, but there's a exception catching mechanism that's happening inside of Ninja that you are able to modify.
Very good.
You can define your own exceptions and you can define what these messages look like inside of that. So this doesn't just have to be for the payload developer. This could be, for example, something goes wrong on your server because of the data mismatches or whatever. It could contain the message that you display to the user if you want to.
And that can be important for localizing error messages or any like. So that's I appreciate you taking the time to show this. It answers Igor's question, I believe. Igor let us know if it doesn't. And no one had to write anything. They just used a type hint.
Yeah, that's all it is, right? So if we go back into our code, basically the difference here is a couple type hints, and that's it's a thing of beauty, right? So
all right, thank you for that.
Okay. All right. So so in order to get going, we're going to need to start serializing some stuff. So far, all I've been serializing is basic strings. This may not look like valid JSON, but it is. We're used to our JSON being all in curly brackets, but a string is legal. So let's do something that's a little fancier. Let me close these down. And I'm going to create another app here. And here we go. So I've now got my Targaryen app. And inside of Targaryen, I'm going to create a new file. And this one's going to be called schemas. And this is where I'm going to be doing my serialization. You don't have to do this in a file called schemas. Ninja does not really care. You do need to be a little careful if you try to put this inside of your models file. Your schemas may reference your models and you can get into cyclical dependency problems. So I just tend to put it in a file called schemas. But there's nothing magical like this. It's not like models.py inside of Django where it's expecting a certain file name. We'll just be importing this later. So let me start with a simple schema. The schemas are called schema objects inside of Ninja. Ninja is built on top of Pydantic. Pydantic, all of the serialization is using the Pydantic tools. Pydantic calls their serializable objects models, and of course, that is problematic if you're inside of the Django space. So Ninja has essentially created a base class called schema, which is, for all intents and purposes, a rename of Pydantic's models so that we don't have to differentiate between a Django model and a Pydantic model. So it's just a schema here. So this is a nice little convenience. And you do not have to have your models based on, sorry, your schemas based on anything in Django. You can just create a straight serialization. And I'm going to start with that, and then I'll show you how to do them with existing Django models later. So let me go here. So this is our first schema. Very much looks like a data class. We just take the attributes that you want inside of your schema, the things that you're going to be serializing, one called name, one called birth year, and again, using all those type hints. So the name's going to be a string, and my birth year is going to be an integer. So like Lannister, I'm going to create a new API file here now. So this is the Targaryen API file. And I'm going to pull in that schema that I just declared. Like Lannister, I need a new router. And then like in Lannister, I'm just going to grab the decorator. I should know better than talk and type at the same time. I am not that talented. All right, so let me just get the rest of the header here, and then I'll come back to it in a second. All right, what I am doing here, remember, I've got dragon out inside of the schemas. This is a bit of a convention. Oftentimes in REST APIs, you're going to need slightly different objects for creating versus returning. For example, if I'm creating, I'm not going to have an ID field inside of it. Whereas if I'm querying an object, I am going to have an ID inside of it. Ninja, by convention in their own documentation, tends to call these in and out schemas. So my dragon out schema is named because I'm going to return some information about a dragon. Again, it doesn't care. This is just sort of a habit. In order to, in the previous example inside a Lannister, I was just returning a straight string which it serializes. Here, I want to take advantage of these schemas. And in order to do that, I fill in this response parameter to the decorator. Again, this takes types. So when I want more than one dragon coming out of this response, then what I'm saying here is this is a list of dragon outs. So this is telling the typing system that I'm going to get I'm going to get a list object, and that list object is going to contain dragon out schemas inside of it. So let's create a couple of those. And you'll notice here, this is just like creating a data class. I create the schema, I pass in the attributes for it that are required, and Ninja takes care of the rest. Definitely need my notes here because I do not know how to spell dragon names. And then all you need to do is return that list. So Ninja is taking this structure based on these schema objects, and by returning it, it will turn this into JSON for you. You do not have to think about JSON. You do not have to think about how any of it works. The serialization takes care of all these things for you. So in order to get this to work, I need to open urls.py back up, and I need to create a route here for our Targaryen place. So let me just edit this. As I mentioned before, I'm renaming the router because all of these things are in files called API and all of them are called router. So this renaming here just allows me to make sure that I don't have any duplicates. And then I register that router just like before. This will end up underneath the API path. So that view that I just created will be /API/Targaryen/dragons. I do not need to edit this line at the bottom because I've already registered the API object. And so I should be good to go. Oh, did I leave this running? Yes, I did. Okay. So there you go. There's your data back, and it's coming back as JSON. The JSON is not pretty printed, and so I will show you one of my favorite little Python tricks, and that is Python has a pretty printer built in. Actually, hold on. Just realizing I'm using the wrong virtual end here, so fixing that. So what I've done here is I'm piping the result through Python -m JSON tool, and that will pretty print the JSON. Curl is spitting out some load data here, and then it pretty prints the actual JSON piece. You can actually also tell curl to be quiet, so -s, and now I don't get all of that progress bar stuff. And so by piping through the JSON tool, I get a nice, pretty printed version of the JSON. And there are our two dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal. This is where my Game of Thrones depth is getting past what I can do, however you pronounce that, all born in year 298. So that'd be a good time to pause before we start getting into serializing ORM objects. Are there more questions?
Yes, good questions, which means they keep bumping out the things I wanted to ask. Let's see. Music Band asked, does Ninja support OAuth 2? I'm actually interested in this question. Is it just delegated to Django?
That's interesting. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head. So the way the authorization mechanism works is there are classes that essentially need to have truthiness in them, and you pass those into the views decorators or into the router or into the API object. You can do it at any of those levels. And it ships with 4 or 5 main ones, like using a key and using Django's OAuth, HTTP basic. I don't remember coming across, sorry, Django's auth, not OAuth. I don't remember coming across OAuth. Generally, I find anything that involves the going to the Django server isn't usually a good idea for REST APIs because you don't want to. So, for example, it supports Django's auth, but in order to do that, what that means is someone has to have logged in through the Django mechanism before it'll work. So, with most REST APIs, you're almost always doing it with a key. And so there are 3 key-based mechanisms that ship with Ninja, and essentially it just comes down to where do you put the key, either in the command line, like in the URL inside of a cookie, or what I usually do, which is put it inside of a header. That being said, you can write your own. It really is a 4-line thing. There's a function inside of a class, and if you can truly, based on the request, say yes, let this person in, or don't let this person in, it's 4 lines of code to do it. So if someone hasn't already written it, you could do it easily.
And these APIs are for machines, not humans.
9 times out of 10,
yeah,
yes.
right. Okay. Jose has a good one because it's going to, I believe it's going to get into type hinting. Suppose, can you go back over to the API definition?
Sure.
All right. And so okay, I'll just give his example. Let's say you have an API with the URL of /singer/singer under param, and you send an empty string for that param. Now, what this would probably map to here would be like, so go to the API you have, which gets a single thing rather than a list. The first one you were working on. Right. So For example, height. What if it was not provided instead of being the wrong type?
So it depends on what you've done with it. So if you want it to be required, what we've done here is that this is
Yep.
required, it'll reject it otherwise. You can provide a default. So if you want it to be optional, just like you could in a request, you can specify that, the default height is 50 meters, for example. And then because it's provided that, it'll allow that.
Right. And if you wanted to detect the case where it wasn't provided, I suspect you could do optional on the int or pipe none and then handle that in the body.
Yeah, you'd provide a default, and then usually, yeah, in most programming cases, that's what you do. You set it to
Yeah.
none, and then inside of the code, you go, "Is this none? Was it something else?" And
Yeah. Right.
and you're writing logic based on it instead of just
The
letting.
thing I find interesting about this question and this answer is that's just normal Python stuff. There isn't some weirdo frameworky thing that you do.
Yeah,
And so you can write these classes in a way they're agnostic of any framework, really,
that's right. Yeah.
and test them easily. And anybody can walk up to it and understand it if they understand type hinting.
Yeah, except for the fact that this code has got this funky decorator on top where you're like, I'm not sure what the decorator does.
Yeah.
Everything else is a Django view, right? So if you've come across view, like you said, views or even just functions, you've got a good idea of what this is. You just need a tiny bit of extra knowledge to be able to go, oh, now it's REST.
Probably a fast one. Richmond asked OpenAPI.
Sorry, what's the question?
Does it support it? Does Ninja support OpenAPI?
I don't know if it does it out of the box.
That was a big selling point for FastAPI, I think, was that it just bundles it.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. It's not something I use myself,
Right.
so it's possible. I don't know how compliant it is.
Google it.
Yes.
Alexandra asked, can you go back over to your listing API?
Yep.
This is going to be opinionated, so that you get your soapbox out for this one. Why is the dragon out list response statically typed? What will happen when you have 100 dragons?
Oh, normally, this is me just showing an example.
Yeah.
So if they're asking why is this two things in here in real code, this is going to be your thing that does whatever it does to spit this out. And in fact, in reality, most of the time, because you're already in Django world, what you're actually going to be mapping is Django ORM objects, which
Right.
I'm going to get to in a second.
I presumed the question was a little bit more of a swipe at static typing and having to type the letters LIST.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I missed the context.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I don't know if there was a implicit condemnation of having to do the extra work for the response, or more specifically, if it was, how am I being helped by that typing? Is there anything in that? I know that FastAPI also had to do that chant to do the typing of the response. It couldn't do it the normal type hinting way as the function response type, return type.
Yeah, you're getting into depths of typing. This isn't something I spend a lot of time with in Python. And if I remember correctly, this has recently changed as well.
It has.
Right?
Yep.
This used to have to be imported from the typing module, right? So this
Okay. Yeah. Right.
itself, this is progress. So
yeah, Python 3.9 and higher lets you do the built-ins also act as generics.
Yeah.
Back over to you. I'll queue up some more good questions that are coming in right now.
Okay. So let's go off and do what we would do in the Django world and create an actual ORM class. More painful than watching somebody else type. Positive, let's do that again, small integer field. Okay, So this is our person object. I've got 3 fields in it in the database, one for name, one for title, and an integer for birth year. Sorry, give me a second. And then in the terminal, migrations, migrate. And then because this is show business, I've inserted some information into the database at this point in time. You would normally be doing that through your admin or whatever else. And then back into schemas. So now I want to do is take that same concept from the ORM and I want to start taking advantage of it. And the person is going to be what I'm serializing. In order to do that, I need a new base class, and this is called the model schema. And for the model schema, you'll find that this is very, very similar to how forms work in Django. So I'm going to go and get me my model. And like my dragon out, I'm going to create a person out. It's going to inherit from the model schema. And then there is a subclass that declares what model is being used. So this says, please serialize a ORM person. And then the only other thing I have to do is say what fields that I want to participate. So I want the ID and the birth year to participate. And that's it. So at this point in time, I spelt that wrong. There we go. I could go off back to our view, and in place of where I was doing things like those dragon pieces, I could go and build a list, but I'm not going to stop here. You can actually do some other things as well. You are not restricted to just the fields in the person. So I can create a new field that doesn't exist inside of the ORM. And just like I do inside of the dragon out schema, I can declare what this is. So now my person out has both the ID and the birth year field from the person, as well as this new field called full name. I can also build something that will populate that automatically. Ninja goes and looks for methods that are static methods inside of model schemas that start with the phrase resolve, and then have the name of the attribute being resolved. So resolve full name will get called to populate this field. The only parameter the argument takes here, the method takes, is the object that's being serialized. So when a person gets serialized, this method will get called and it'll get passed in as the object. And then all I need to do is return a appropriate type. So I'm going to take the person's name and their title, and I'm going to combine those in a single string. And now my person out will have an ID, a birth year, and a full name instead of the name and title that was inside of the ORM. Okay. So taking that back inside of Targaryen API, and now it's time to write our API for getting that person. I am going to add a quick Django shortcut here. And I need the person. And I need the schema that I just wrote, person out. Okay. Now it's time to write the actual route. So I'm going to go and do person. I want a integer person ID that is going to be passed into me. And I want the response to be a person out schema. So this is similar to what was happening in the previous example with the dragon out. I'm returning a serializable object, and I'm using the URL to identify what's going on here. And then, like you're used to, take in that person ID And all I have to do now is return the actual query. Like before, this has been registered already because I created the Targaryen API. So all I need to do is go back to curl. And I will query person one. And there you go, Mother of Dragons. So with very, very little code, it's basically 3 lines. I've taken the concepts that we have in the ORM and passed them back inside of the views. And this all gets serialized as you go along. This is typically what you're usually doing very, very frequently inside of these places. What you're trying to do is get the actual ORM data into your API. So it's really, really common to, I want, like say you're doing a bookstore, right? You want the books, you want the authors, you want the publisher information, but you've probably got all of that inside of your database. So all you really need to do is get that out into the API through the serialization. So by using something like this person out mechanism with a few lines of code, you can serialize all of that. There are some shortcuts here. For example, for model fields, there's a _all. So you can say, hey, just give me all the fields. So you don't have to type them out. And there's also a except. So you can say, give me all the fields except for those that are listed here. And really what this comes down to is, I've been concentrating in just the gets, but the rest of the API is just change out what these values are. So if you want to do a post, you change this to a post. You need to give information about the payload that's coming in, the person in, and then you go off and create it. Similar for the puts and patches. In the case of a delete, same concept. You go in, when you get the object, you do like a get object on that person, do your delete, and then return the success as you go along. So there's one last thing that I want to show you that is very DRF. Just get the browser going here. Let's see if I can remember the URL. Oh, I got it wrong. There we go. So this is built into Ninja's API. Let me just take this to the full screen for you. And what you can see is it shows you each one of the API endpoints that you've created. If you open this up, it'll give you information about what fields are necessary. So I can hit the try it out button and I can fill this in and say, I want person number 2, and then execute. And at the bottom here, it'll show you the response body, the response headers, and it even shows you what you would have had to have typed in curl in order to get this response. So you can copy and paste this off to your terminal and try it out for yourself. So this is really, really handy for the debugging. If you get into things like the authentication mechanism, there'll be a button up here for authenticating, so you can put in your keys and manage those kinds of things as well. So this is really, really powerful tool while you're going through and trying to build and debug your API. Want to take a few more questions here, Paul, before we wrap up?
Yeah, sure. That's a cool UI to end on. That's really well done. We'll go through some things kind of fast because we're running out of time. Pagination from the ORM.
Ninjas has its own pagination mechanism inside of it. I've never used it, but I have seen it in the docs. So I'm guessing you probably want to use whatever tool they've got there rather than the ORMs.
All right, Juan, hopefully that answers the question. Igor was asking about more complex validations, but then you kind of got into it with the class config and the resolve and things like that. Is that all just straight Pydantic?
Pretty much, yeah. They've put a very thin layer on top of it. So if you're familiar with Pydantic, then it should be something you've seen before.
And an interesting extension of that is there's a kind of an ecosystem around Pydantic now. So you're tapping into something rather than Ninja having to write it all itself.
Yes. Yeah.
Panel was asking, can I use in model under fields dunder all like in Django form building?
Yes. It's a string, and it's let me double check it to get it right, but I've got it somewhere. Hold on. Yeah, it is just dunder all. It's model underscore fields equals quote dunder all dunder.
Alexandria is asking, how do out and in schemas avoid having duplicate code, especially for custom fields?
So they're just objects. So if you've got something particularly clever going on, you can usually use inheritance to get around it.
Yeah, throw Python at it.
Yeah.
Python knows how to do that. Zenu's asking if full under name also exists in the original model and we override it with resolve under full under name, will it cause an error?
I've never tried it, but I would presume as long as, whoops, wrong screen, my apologies. I would presume as long as you didn't include it in your model fields, you're probably okay.
Last one. No, sorry, almost last one. Nurkin is asking a great question. Relations between two tables.
Yes. So there is a mechanism for nesting these things because these are all just types. I can just like I did with the response, where I can say a list of dragon out fields. I can get into more complicated types here, and so I can start having references between one and the other. So
Yeah.
it allows me to populate all those pieces going down.
Extremist Development is asking how to filter data in list-oriented endpoints. I suspect that's just normal.
Yeah, it would be no different than if you were trying to do
Yeah.
it inside, say, a page view, because
Yeah, right.
we're back to just views, right? So,
That's right.
add a query parameter string, for example, and affect the
Throw the
affect
ORM
the
at it.
actual query. Yeah.
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 All right. And it was being pointed out at the end. It looks like FastAPI, but which ORM are you using? Probably someone who showed up a little late at the webinar. Okay, that covers all of the questions that we have from the audience, except mine, because I really wanted to talk about testing and developing your API
Please.
independently of the back end, but
Sure.
I don't get to talk about that.
You want to talk about testing, because it's just Django. Sorry, Paul. How much Django do you know? Are you
Well, actually, my question was if this mode of development where you develop the front end without the back end being written yet, and is there a way in the API layer to return dummy data until you decided what the app should look like?
I see. I don't see why you wouldn't. It would just be views, as far as I'm
Yeah,
concerned,
right.
Like if you're doing TDD from that perspective, and then coming at it from the other side is because Django's got a rich test harness mechanism. You can use you do not have to be running a Django server in order to test Django.
Sure.
And these APIs, because they're just views, you can just hit them. So either direction you're coming from.
Good point. Yeah. At the end of the day, these API views are Django views. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Great. Okay. Over to you for a wrap up.
Okay. Yep. And last little bit of shameless self-promotion here. So first and foremost, this is me. For my Canadian viewers, listeners, no relation. I don't know if the rest of the world will get that or not, but there's 5,000 Trudeaus in Canada, and none of us know Justin. Couple courses here that I just want to promo. The first one here is Django Getting Started on Talk Python. If you know somebody, most of the folks on this call are probably a little more familiar with Django, but if you know somebody who's trying to pick it up, or you want to get a little deeper into things there, this is a 6.5-hour course. It's really, really in depth. It's got a lot of pieces there. And there are a couple different URLs here. There are a first come, first serve. I don't know how many tokens, but if that first URL there, that's free entry to the course for the first few people who get there. And then once that's expired, it's been eaten up on the internet, then the regular URL is here. And then the second one is released, I think, about an hour ago, if the timing is correct. At Real Python is the full version of what I was just talking about here. It's about 70 minutes long, gets into some of the questions we had here, like authentication, goes full on of the whole CRUD stack, exception processing, some other things is there. This course, the courses are usually behind a paywall, but there are a number of free tokens here as well. So first come, first serve on those, and otherwise head out there. Happy to take your DMs there on Twitter if you've got questions or you get stuck on something. And otherwise, reach out and happy coding.
Before switching over to my slides, if I could make a shameless plug about your shameless plug. Everyone out there that's watching, spend a little money. These are both quality venues, both Talk Python and Real Python, small, independent, successful outfits in the world of Python who deserve our support. And if you don't buy that, then you should buy Your Time is Valuable. And Christopher has pre-chewed the food for you. And it's money well spent to get something professional when you are doing professional work. Both of these courses, the existing Django one and this new one, are worth pursuing. And they're not crazy long, right?
No, so the Ninja course is a little over an hour, and the Django one is pretty intense. Actually, it's 6.5. So it's
right.
But it's everything. It's views, ORMs, templates. It goes into some of the third-party libraries, migrations, testing. It's a full introduction course.
And that's the way we should be learning. We should all be learning more intentionally by sitting down, clearing our brain, and studying rather than cut and paste from Stack Overflow.
For sure. Well, and one of the things I'm kind of proud of with the Django course is I've intentionally made each chapter have a testing piece. So it's not quite TDD, but it's very much how you're supposed to develop if you're coding in real life. I'm going to write something and then I'm going to test it. I'm going to write something and I'm going to test it. So almost every chapter ends with, and this is how you write the tests in order to test that thing you just learned. So it's there's some very real world practical concepts in there.
Totally with you on that. I try and get people to think of it as tests first. This isn't about eating your vegetables. It's more productive than flipping over to the browser and hitting reload constantly.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, let's switch over to my slides for the outro. Thanks a lot, Chris, for taking the time to walk us through Django API development with Ninja, which looks really interesting for people looking for the next generation of API development. What's the one takeaway point that you would like people to walk out with?
You know what? It's a bit of an aside, but one of the things I always try to remember with all this is it's all free and it's all somebody's baby, right? Like this is somebody who's trying to scratch an itch here and solve a problem. And you know, I've submitted a couple small documentation changes as I was going through. It's like, oh, I could explain this a little better. They're very accepting of PRs. You know, this is you know, you hear people talking about the community all the time, but it really is a fantastic place to be coding. And the guys at Ninja have been pretty supportive with things as well. So, you know, whether it's Ninja or something else, try out what's out there. Find that thing that is good for you, and then contribute if you can. And you know, contribution is often very, very simple. In this particular case, with Ninja, I had a question. The question wasn't quite in the docs. It was buried somewhere. And I'm like, oh, can I submit an answer to the question in the docs? It could go here. And he was like, yeah, great, do it. So even if you're not, you know, you don't consider yourself a hardcore coder, something as simple as writing a paragraph inside a documentation is a contribution. So whether it's Ninja or something else, I encourage people to get involved and feed the ecosystem.
And if nothing else, you can contribute with a thank you for these people who
Very
are
much so.
closing bug reports to solve other people's problems. And they can also say thank you to people like you. Melissa Strong says the Django course looks amazing. Thank you so much. So that's a nice way to go ahead and end this. If you'd like to get more information on PyCharm, such as things like these webinars, go to our website at jetbrains.com/PyCharm. If you haven't already taken a look, go to our blog. You'll find up-to-date information about releases. Things are cranking out. Got some releases coming out, including EAP one with the new UI, which is generating a lot of interest, as well as events such as this webinar, where you'll also get a link to the recording on this. We'd love your feedback about this webinar, which I'll share with Christopher, the points about this. We actually read them. So you'll get, if you registered, you'll get a link to the survey, fill in the survey, tell us what you think, look for it in your email. That's it for us today. Christopher, thanks a bunch for joining us.
It was fun.
Yeah, it was. And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a nice day.